Michael Tonsmeire joins me to discuss barrel-aged sour beers. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 255. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 255, and it's early April 2022. Michael Tonsmeire joins me this week to discuss barrel-aged sour beers. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And the web-based version of BeerSmith with the new inventory module is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. The web-based version gives you access to tens of thousands of recipes, online recipe editing, advanced water tools, and much more. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days for free by going to beersmithrecipes.com and setting up an account. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version for one low price. Check out beersmithrecipes.com now and give BeerSmith Web a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back Michael Tonsmeire. Michael is the author of the book Sour Beers, as well as author of the blog, The Mad Fermentationist. Michael is also an award-winning brewer, certified beer judge, and founder of the brewery, Sapwood Cellars, in Columbia, Maryland. Michael, how you doing today?
I'm doing really well, Brad. It was a little bit of a hustle to get home. We were at the brewery getting ready for a canning day tomorrow, but the beers are all carved and crashed and ready to go, so I get to enjoy my Monday night now.
Well, that's awesome. How are things going at Sapwood Cellars? I think the last time we had you on, let's see, it was December of 2020 was the last time I had you on.
Yeah, so it's pretty much been the same for the last, year and a half. We've been doing a lot more beers in cans.
Interesting.
But luckily, we're certainly seeing in the last couple of months that people are starting to really come back out to the tasting room. And we just had a little private event space, and that's been a lot of 40th birthday parties. So 40th birthday parties seem to be our target demographic. And I just turned 39, so I'm my own target demographic, I guess.
So so you have a birthday party event location now, right?
Yeah, it's got a ball pit. It's everything that the 40-year-old beer nerd would enjoy.
Excellent. Do you have you mentioned canning? Do you have your own canning line now?
No, we're still doing mobile canner. It's we're pretty sort of tight on space. It's great just to have them show up and can the beer for us and then take that canning line away. And if something goes wrong, I kick my heels up and they deal with it. Eventually, I'm sure we'll figure out our own line. But for the time being, it's nice to have somebody else deal with that headache.
And the tap room's back open. I assume most of the restrictions are gone in Maryland now. I know here in Virginia, they've been gone for some time, but.
Yeah, we're still working on getting some outdoor seating back again, but the sort of the tasting room itself has been open. We were closed for about 2 months right at the start of COVID, but slowly they've been lifting the maximum occupancy and the spacing and all that. So we're happy because that's, honestly, to me, that's one of the real joys of being a brewer is being able to go out there in the tasting room and talk to people, see people drinking the beers, ask them, which ones they're enjoying from the new releases. You can do that sort of online, but there's something that's a little bit more fun about actually being able to go out there and just talk to the people who keep you in business.
So which beers are most popular in the tap room right now?
For us, it's always been the IPAs and the double IPAs.
Yeah.
Those certainly are the sort of, people will try a lot of other things. They'll get a half pour of the unique beers. And then we also are certainly seeing, we've really started doing the barrel-aged stouts and barley wines. And those have really been sort of a lot of growth for us in those, and fun flavors and coconut and vanilla. And we just did one with geisha coffee that a good friend of mine roasted for us. And those sort of big desserty beers, I think people are still very much in the mode of wanting a beer that is just a big marshmallow hug of deliciousness
Yeah.
and maybe not something that's dry or bitter or challenging. People really want, the Marvel Cinematic Universe of beer at the moment, I think.
Are the hazy IPAs going crazy still?
Yeah, we certainly still see, those are just easy beers to iterate on that, pretty much every month we do an IPA and a double IPA. The one we are just getting ready to can in a week or so is 100% Nelson Sauvin. The good folks from New Zealand Hops gave us some really fantastic Nelson for a collab, and we've just sort of
hard to get these days, right?
Yeah. And we've been playing with some sort of new fun hops too. We just did one with Hydra, which is a Michigan hop that has this really intense sort of fruity, almost bubblegum flavor. And
yeah, I had some of the Michigan growers on, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. They came on the podcast and talked about some of their experiences.
Yeah, no, we've been really impressed by a couple of theirs. And then we had Strata in that one as well, which is sort of a super Citra or a super Mosaic or something like that we've really enjoyed. We do a lot of just sort of like split batches, or we'll get a pound of hops and dry hop a 15-gallon keg with it and just sort of try things out. A lot of the hops, they have a marketing team coming up with the flavor descriptors, but it's always great to use them yourself and see what really shines, and then go from there.
Awesome. Well, when you launched your brewery, I knew sour beers were certainly a key focus, barrel-aged sour beers, I guess, specifically.
Yeah.
How has your sour beer production gone over I think it's been 3 years since you opened, roughly?
Yeah, no, it's sort of the first things we brewed were sour beers and got into barrels. And early on, there was a lot of confusion about, hey, we thought you were going to be the sour beer place. Where are the sours? And we had to explain, hey, we'll do some kettle sours too. We've been playing around with Philly sour and doing some quicker sours. But the barrel aged stuff takes some time. And it took us almost a year from the time we opened to the release of that first barrel aged Saison, mixed ferment, wild ale, whatever you want to call it. It's gone pretty well. We about a year ago took over a separate suite in our same office park. And that's just dedicated to sour beer production now. So it's got about 80 or 85 oak barrels, and it's got some fruiting tanks and our little sour beer bottler and sort of the things you don't sort of imagine when you're starting out is how much space you're just going to need for filled bottles and empty bottles. There are, if we're bottle conditioning a batch for 2 or 3 months, sometimes even longer than that, there's 3 or 4 pallets of sour beer. They're always in the process of being bottle conditioned or waiting on labels. And then we hang on to 5 or 10 cases of most of the batches so that we can have vintage releases. So when this year's cherry sour beer comes out in, say 6 months from now, a few months after cherry season, we can dust off a couple of cases of the one we did 2 years ago, and we can have those for in-house bottles, or we can have bottle pours for people, just as a way to bring people into the tasting room and to give them a chance to try, hey, if you hang on to your bottle for 2 years, do you like it more or less? That fruit flavor might, die off a little bit. But, hey, maybe you'll like it more, maybe you won't. And so I always view the tasting room as a real sort of experience. The reason that you're coming into the tasting room, the reason you're going out of your way is to get something that's different than just buying a 6-pack from your local liquor store or from the supermarket or whatever. Getting a taste of a beer, getting to talk to someone who's knowledgeable about the beer, getting to try a real variety of beers. And I think sour beer, particularly barrel-aged sour beer, there's such a range to it that I want to give people the chance to come in and say, tell the bartender, I've never had a beer that's sour enough, for me. Oh, hey, you might want to try this one. This is one of our most sour beers. Or someone who says, hey, I really like fruit. I just want something that's a little tangy. Hey, maybe this would be a better option for you. And so that sort of service and that sort of experience is something that we really value on the sour beer side more than the IPA side, where everyone has had 50 IPAs. You like Citra, great, try the Citra IPA. You like Nelson, fine, try the Nelson IPA.
And I'm trying to remember, don't you have like a membership program or something that you're distributing some of your select beers through?
Yeah, so we do a couple of different sort of club-based things, and in terms of cash flow and sort of guaranteed sales, it's I don't know how we would have survived without it. it includes, like for the sour one, it includes 2 bottles each of 8 different releases. And so we can really sort of tailor those. Hey, we know the sour red with cherries is going to be part of the club membership. Maybe we make that a 3 oak barrel blend, just knowing that the club members are already soaking up 1/3 of that volume. It can be, sort of tricky with these beers. It's always a mystery to me which ones are going to hit on people's palates and which ones aren't. Sometimes the beers that I like the most, because they're balanced and subtle. And, we did one with rhubarb that I love, just rhubarb, not strawberry rhubarb or raspberry rhubarb, but just rhubarb. Rhubarb is a very gentle flavor, and it just adds just a little of this extra fruitiness. To me, it has sort of almost a little green apple, maybe a little touch of berry. I love that beer. It's pretty low acid. The pH was in the 3.5s. And people are just like, oh, it's a fine beer, but it doesn't feel as special as a beer that is really sour or intensely fruited with, peaches or nectarines or cherries, something that's a very obvious flavor. And so partly it's just us learning, which of those beers people will enjoy, and also which one is just going to, when they, read about the beer, rhubarb maybe isn't the exciting flavor that cherry or raspberry or something, or wine grapes or something like that is. And so we would love to see, we love those weird experimental beers, but we also know that sort of the ones that are slam dunks tend to be the flavors that people are familiar with. That people are looking for something that is, oh yeah, raspberries. I love raspberries. I'll try the raspberry beer.
That makes sense, yeah. Now I'm trying to remember, you do primarily traditional sour beers. Do you do kettle souring as well, or no?
Yeah, so we did, particularly now that sort of the canning has come on, the mobile canner we use, Ironheart, is fantastic, and they actually recently added a sour beer only line. The trick with that is it's rare that we would have multiple sour beers ready to go at the same time. But they will let us do, for a while we were doing kettle sours, and then they allowed us to do Philly sour. So the Lachancia thermotolerans. And for us, that's been a real benefit. The kettle sours, the way we were doing them, which is just sort of the classic, boil the wort, cool it down to 100 degrees, pitch a nice little starter of lacto. The problem we'd run into is sometimes, I think the first one we did, it hit the right pH for us at around 10 p.m. The day after brew day. And so Scott was there until about 3 in the morning, boiling that thing, cooling it, pitching it. And Philly sour for us so far has been pretty reliable. You pitch it. We found fermenting on the warmer end. They originally were talking about maybe starting in the 70s. We found pitching around 76 to 78 and keeping it in that range, maybe up to 80. It gets down to about 3.3 pH. It's pretty clean. It has a little apple cinnamon kind of thing to me.
That's one of the questions I had. So how do you, what pH level do you target if you're doing a rapid sour like that?
So for me, it really depends on the flavor you're looking for and the sort of overall balance. So it's really surprising, like 3.3 or 3.2 even doesn't taste very sour if you are mashing it 158. We don't do lactose, but we'll do maltodextrin for a little body and sweetness. We'll do a lot of fruit. And we'll get comments that our beer isn't sour at all, even though the pH is at 3.2.
Well, fruits, depending on what fruit you're using, adds a lot of acidity as well, right?
Certainly, and it depends exactly on the kind of fruit you're using, and even obviously, like pH isn't the be all end all, titratable acidity and all those sorts of things.
Right.
Sort of the impression of the acidity can be different if it's a fruit that has a lot of citric or tartaric or malic acid.
Right.
And so I tend to be around 3.2 for those sort of sweeter. We'll do, like we just did one with blueberry puree and maple syrup. And so that's like it reads sweeter than it probably really is, just because you associate maple or vanilla or things like that with sweetness.
Right.
On the other hand, it's amazing to me how sour a barrel-aged sour beer can taste if it's at 3.3 or 3.4 even. Because you're probably getting, we'll get into this later on our process, but we do everything we can to limit acetic acid production. I think so many more beers are ruined by too much acetic acid. They're benefited from just a little bit. So everything gets purged. We're pretty fanatical about keeping oxygen out, which would lead to acetic acid and ethyl acetate.
Acetobacter, which then produces vinegar, right?
Exactly, and just a little bit of vinegar can add some sharpness or some brightness, but it's very easy to go overboard with that. But even with all our sort of process, you're always going to get a little bit of oxygen exposure in barrels. As the beer evaporates, the head space at the top sort of empties out a little.
Of course, yeah.
And then the wood at the top dries out and a little bit of oxygen will get in. So even though I will toss or dump any barrel that has identifiable acetic or ethyl acetate, but there's always going to be a little bit in there.
Yeah, they call that the angel share, I think, when they're barreling whiskey, right?
Exactly. And it's for us, it's about 5 gallons a year. And that really, we top up barrels and things like that. But those beers are generally very dry. They're finishing pretty close to zero most of the time. And as a result, they can taste pretty sharp. And we've put a lot of effort the last year into reducing our level of acidity. As much of an honor as it is, people will show me a picture of their cellar. They'll open their phone. They'll say, "Look at this. I've got 2 bottles each of every single bottle you've ever released." And I appreciate that. It sounds very nice, but I would rather that they drank the beers. And to me, it said something about some of our beers that the acid was probably at a level where it was a fun beer to try that you would want to open with a group of friends and each have a couple of ounces of and slowly sip and go, wow, this is so intense, or it's so bright, or it's the fruit flavor is so over the top and the acid. But at a certain point, you need to brew beers that people almost can't help themselves but drink because they're so delicious. And you opened one with your friend on Friday night, and then you're looking at your cellar on Saturday, and you went, "Man, that beer was so good, and I only got to have half of it. I'm going to open one for myself tonight." And we see that we've started doing more lagers, and we see people buy another 4-pack of the same lager they bought last weekend, this weekend, because they tossed one of the Pilsners over the fence to their neighbor, and they threw one into a pot of chili, and they drank 2 of them, over the weekend, and all of a sudden their 4-pack's gone.
Right.
And so I would love to get more sour beers that people just drank as an everyday part of enjoying beer, and that they didn't necessarily feel that were so dear that they had to sit on them and bring them to a special bottle share or cellar them until they became something even more special that was even harder to find an excuse to open. And so part of that for us is, making sure that price doesn't get too high, even though it's always going to be a little bit higher than, quick sour or something like that when you're dealing with barrels and local fruit and blending and bottle conditioning and just the cocktail glass. But you really want to have something that people just feel like is delicious and they want to drink.
Absolutely. Well, I know you mentioned before the show that you have your sour beer production has actually evolved quite a bit over the years, and you have a number of lessons learned. Let's start with microbes or bugs. I think you started with quite an array of sources for your microbes, right?
Yeah, sort of the same thing I did when I was helping Modern Times start out their sour program, and I did sort of the same thing behind the scenes for a bunch of other breweries. Sort of my instinct starting out is always, unless you have a house culture that you have worked with at a decent scale,
right? You
just don't know what those microbes are going to do in the particular barrels, humidity, temperature, not only the average temperature, but how that temperature changes, how that temperature, you might have heaters at the top of the brewery that make those barrels at the top hotter. You might have an uninsulated roof that in the summer, those barrels at the top are hotter or cooler.
Right.
And so I just went, hey, let's just try a bunch of different things. And so we bought a bunch of different microbial cultures from cool yeast labs or cultures I'd used in the past I really liked. We borrowed bottle dregs microbes and grew them up from some of our favorite unpasteurized sour beer commercial examples from Belgium and the US and other places. We grew up some homebrew microbes that we, had bottles that we loved or from barrels that we had at home that we really liked. Grew up those microbes and add those to barrels. And sort of, as you would predict, the results were inconsistent. We had some barrels that were too sour. We had some barrels that were not sour enough. And honestly, that's totally fine in the sense that that gives you options. To me, sort of making a barrel program for traditional sours is like being a painter and coming up with a bunch of different colors to paint with. No matter how much you like green and how many different shades of green you have, you won't do a very good job painting an eggplant.
Right.
You really need to, tease out those different colors. And so for us, it was very, trying a bunch of different base beers, having, red sours and golden sours, some that we mashed pretty hot, some that we mashed pretty cool. Trying to get a real variety of barrel sources, some from local vineyards that were freshly dumped, some that were from, barrel brokers.
Just off the top of my head, are there any commercial examples, like from White Labs or one of the other labs that really worked out well for you that people might be able to access?
Yeah, one of my favorites, and we've actually used it in our Berliner Weiss a couple of times. We've also used it in barrels. The Melange blend from the Yeast Bay.
Okay.
I really like. It's got that. If you like Lindemann's Cuvée René, or almost like a very good version of it would be like the Driefonteinen house culture. It's like very lemony and minerally. Mm-hmm. It's tart, but not like assertively sour. But then it's all just going to depend on that base beer and exactly how it plays with your microbes and your all that sort of thing. I like that. If you can get it, the East Coast Yeast Flemish, I can't remember if they call it the Flemish Ale Blend or the Flemish Red Blend. Mm-hmm. Really good in maltier beers. It doesn't get too funky. I don't love darker or red sours with a really strong, leathery Brett kind of flavor. But honestly, at this point, we've really sort of moved on from that. We really don't add many new microbes. What we tend to do is either we've done, hey, we have a dedicated sour fermenter. We're going to pitch some dry ale yeast. And then on brew day, while my brewer Ken is doing the hard work of actually, putting the grain and whatever together and boiling and all that, I'm over in the sour house tasting barrels and going, wow, this one's been in oak for 6 months. It has this really cool peachy ester profile. Uh-huh. That'd be perfect for this. And I'll pull 4 or 5 gallons from that barrel, put it into a keg, bring it over, and we'll just shoot it in. And so we're really developing a house culture or a house microbial selection.
So you got maybe an array now of them, I guess, from the existing beers then, huh?
And that's exactly it. That depending on the beer we're brewing, we might choose a different, barrel that made more or less sense. So if we're doing a dark sour, I'm going to pick one that hopefully has maybe more, some cherry notes or some, a little bit of leather, a little bit of dark fruit, something like that. And we're brewing something that's sort of light and bright. Cool. Let's go with a stone fruity or a lemony or something that I think is going to complement it. But then each barrel is also being refilled generally from a previous batch. And so then each of the barrels will have its own slight riff on that initial flavor.
Yeah, because I think we did a session on barrels, right? But I assume you were using the barrels several times over.
Yeah, and that's actually what finally, for the first year or so, honestly, our biggest problem was we had too many first use barrels. So first use to us being, sometimes having 2, 3, 4 wines run through it. All our beers had a very assertive, identifiable oak character, which I'm fine with. But again, going back to that palate analogy, they all had oak. We really didn't have anything. And once or twice what we would do is blend in stainless steel aged beer or beer that was just, maybe we kept beer in stainless steel for a little longer and then just finished it in the barrel for 4 or 5 months just as a way to have it not be too oaky. And now finally, we've got a bunch of these barrels that we've done 3, 4 turns in, and we're finally retiring some. They're not bad barrels. They're just losing their oak or their signature flavor. And now we can get some fresh gin barrels to do. We're doing a gin barrel aged pale sour that'll get dry hopped. Or we can get some fresh port barrels, or we might bring in some spirit barrels, bringing in barrels that will add some signature or particular character to the beer. And so that's been sort of that balance. Vin Chorzo from Russian River, when I interviewed him for the book, talked about having about 1/3 of the barrels he would use for a lot of his beers were brand new from a winery. About 1/3 he'd done one turn through them. About 1/3 he'd done two turns through them. And that was about the right ratio for him and his beers. And I'm sure he has evolved in his opinion of these things over the years. But that's sort of what I would like to move towards. Would be, you know, about a third to a quarter of the barrels I'm filling would be new barrels if I'm looking for that sort of signature flavor. But you could also, and he would then sort of, as beers would go down the line, they would go to his spontaneous fermentation project, or they would go to a different series of beers that he wasn't looking for that distinct Sauvignon Blanc or Cabernet or whatever barrel flavor from. He just was more looking for that neutral, it's a place for the microbes to live, and that's about it.
Now, a lot of us as homebrewers obviously have to worry about contamination, particularly with equipment. You mentioned, I think another change you made was you now have sort of a dedicated area just for producing sour beers, right? Yeah,
and so it's, you know, sort of a separate unit, and eventually would love to sort of connect the two units together with the suite that's between them. But it's just nice not having to worry about, now that it's not just Scott and myself, people can be over in the sour suite bottling cider and not worry that a little bit of those microbes are going to be sprayed out while someone else is cleaning a tank that's supposed to get the IPA into it the next day. To my knowledge, we never had an issue with cross-contamination. But that's also like for a long time, we're just kegging beers, and the kegs were being stored cold and sold on tap in our tasting room and really not leaving our site. And so not that it's something you should ever try to fall back on, but that certainly was a good little safety net to us that we spent a year before we were canning any clean beers. And so we've always had dedicated hoses, and we have color-coordinated gaskets. So the gaskets we use for our sour beers are white or clear, and we use the more traditional sort of black tri-clamp gaskets for the clean beers. We have buckets that are bright orange for sour gear to be in, just because sometimes we do have to bring them over. We have one sour fermenter on the clean side, and so that's a little bit of a risk, and would eventually love to have it be totally separate, but that's not always practical. But yeah, I wouldn't worry about, you know, having sour beer in the same homebrew area. I'd more worry about sharing the equipment.
Yeah, obviously.
It's just so hard to clean every little scratch in a plastic bucket or something like that. As a home brewer, obviously, your risk is a lot lower, that you're not worried about, you know, sending beer out to a store and it's going to sit warm for 6 months. But in the same way, like, you put a lot of effort into making beer, and you're going to enter in a contest, or you're going to share it with friends, or you're going to cellar that imperial stout. The more you can do to ensure that that's clean, the more it'll be worth your time and effort and all of that.
Now, how does your sour beer production compare in volume, compared to your regular beer production?
Oh, we'll joke around. You know, we'll spend like a whole day. So we have just it's a 4-head filler, so it can fill one bottle at a time on 4 heads. About a 10-second CO2 purge. It pressurizes for a couple of seconds, then it fills in about 30 or 40 seconds. So we'll spend two of us will spend 6 hours bottling, 45 or 50 cases of beer, and then the next day we'll have a canning run, and we'll do 300 cases, and those are 24 can cases rather than 12. So it's probably 10 times as much beer.
So yeah. The sour beering still a bit of a specialty thing, right?
Yeah, and I think for us, we've certainly heard from other breweries that these beers are not doing very well out in the market. Just the price point that, a lot of our sour beers they tend to be $14 to $18 a bottle for a 500 ml.
Wow.
You can do that at your tasting room, where people are coming in there and they maybe get to try the beer on tap, and they get to hear the story about it, and they, hey, we're
probably hard to move on the supermarket shelf where you can get, a case of Schlitz for that much or something,
Or you can get a 4-pack of a cherry kettle sour for the same price as one bottle.
Right.
And without understanding that, yeah, there's a big difference between using, and we use plenty of aseptic purees on the kettle sour, Philly sour side because they're practical and you can get them year round and they're easy to work with, but you're never going to get the depth of flavor from
traditional
Oregon cherry puree as you will from actual cherries from a local farm that still have the skins and the stems and the pits and that may or may not be a good thing. We've certainly had some cherry beers that to me have a little bit too much of that like green stemmy sort of flavor to them, but you sort of know it's a real product and hey, it's aged in a barrel. It's going to have a lot more sort of interesting flavor. It is a more connoisseur's product, but for a lot of people, they just want a beer that tastes like cherries and is delicious. And there's nothing wrong with that. And at the tasting room, they can sort of find out what they do and don't want, where it's hard to just pull that trigger on the store shelf. And
of course,
unless you're going over to someone's house for dinner and you go, oh, I know they like cherries. I'll get them the special bottle and, maybe they'll open it and, it's
like a nice bottle of wine or something similar to that.
Exactly.
So you also mentioned, I think your hop schedules have evolved quite a bit over the years, particularly related to your sour beers.
Yeah, so we started out and the brewery that was in the space before us had bought a bunch of hops and just sort of like left them there. And we went, hey, free aged hops, we're not going to say no to that. And I think we probably overdid it a little bit early on. I think I'm more sensitive than some people to that particular aged hop flavor. And a good aged hop should not be like really cheesy. They shouldn't be rancid. But they have this sort of hay-like, or to me, it can almost be a little toasty. And we were going a little bit too heavy-handed on them, and I was really getting that flavor. Last summer, we did our first sort of, I won't say lambic, I won't say goose, I will say 3-year blend of aged hop, unmalted wheat, pilsner, barrel age, mixed ferment, whatever. And it was a 3-year blend. There was not very much of the 3-year-old beer. The 3-year-old beer was very oaky. And it was very aged hoppy. And as a 10% component of the blend, I think it made the beer much more interesting and much more delicious. But it's definitely not what you would want a beer like that to be in the long term. And as we tasted those beers, the younger they were, the better they were. The old beer had very low acid because
they didn't age well, huh?
Well, I'm not sure it ever was terrific. And it was also a little unfair in the sense that I think the only 3-year-old barrel we had left, we had passed over for barrels we liked more than it a couple of times. Because that's sort of what you end up with these, you taste the 5 barrels that you filled from that one batch.
Peter principle here, huh, in barrel aging.
Exactly. Okay, we want one for apricots. Ooh, that one's got some weird flavor. We'll see how that is in another year. But that is really sort of the tricky thing with barrel aged sour beers. I think Ron Jeffries from Jolly Pumpkin said something along the lines of like, you stick with what works because you don't want to go and change your process and then 2 years from now go, oh man, I really shouldn't have done that. But now I've got 2 years of beers that are going off in the wrong direction. But to me, again, it's all the more reason to try a variety of things early on. We have been continuing to buy a lot of hops. A lot of hop suppliers will send out an email and they'll say, hey, with your next order, if you want any of these hops that are older than 2017, just pay for shipping and we'll give them to you, kind of things. And it can be nice. Fun. Yeah. And it's fun that like we've used some aged New Zealand hops, we've used some aged American hops. Something like Cascade that you wouldn't traditionally think of going into sour beer, but has a lot of fun compounds that maybe the Brettanomyces can free the glycosides, and it can, maybe have some interactions with some of the other things that are going on. And so those are the kinds of things that we try, and we try them at a pretty low level. We're doing at this point, it's closer to the equivalent of, so it's, like 5.5 pounds in 10 barrels, which works out to, what is that? That's you divide by
half a pound a barrel, roughly. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, so something like that. So yeah, 8 ounces in 31 gallons. So it's not a huge amount. It's just an ounce or two in a 5-gallon bag.
That's pretty low rate. Yeah.
And for us, we're we've done some wild capture stuff. I think of the aged hops as being much more important if you're doing a cool ship. At that stage, you're really looking to inhibit lactobacillus, which might take over during that really slow cooling process exposed to the air. Since we are just cooling with a heat exchanger and going into a tank, we're not really worried about lactobacillus. Running wild overnight as it's slowly cooling from down through lactobacillus's sweet range in the 100-degree 45 Celsius sort of range. And so it's more of a flavor thing. And so for us, it's better to be on the low end than to be too much.
Well, you mentioned also, obviously most of your beers come off of a barrel, but you got to carbonate and package them. And you said that process also has kind of changed over the years for you.
Yes. As a home brewer, I was really sort of just that very standard, go into a bottling bucket with some priming sugar, sprinkle in maybe a little yeast. I would always give it a little bit of a stir. I never really trusted the whirlpool action. It always seemed like the sugar would just sort of hang out there. And that's honestly the same way a lot of professional and very good breweries package their sour beers. A lot of them get gravity wine fillers where it just sort of, the beer sort of flows into a trough.
So a lot of these are naturally carbonated then, right? Sorry.
Exactly. The trick is that there's always a little bit of question about how much residual CO2 you have in particularly barrel-aged beer. As a home brewer, my sort of rule of thumb was it was about half as much CO2 as the calculator would think that you had. So if it had been at 70 degrees and it had been a barrel, a calculator might say you have 0.8 volumes of residual CO2. Right. I always found it was closer to maybe 0.4. That just that rough interior surface of the barrel, you don't have any back pressure. You probably had some temperature fluctuations as it aged. And it was probably a little bit lower than that. But if you then re-ferment on fruit or something, you're going to resaturate it. The trick is, as a professional brewer who does not have a huge amount of money, and it's not cheap, but we have a Zammernagel. So essentially, it's just a little pressure cylinder. You hook it up, you attach it to your sample valve, you fill it, you vent it, you shake it. They are pretty accurate and very helpful, but they won't go below about 1.5 volumes of CO2. So if you're lower than that, it just reads 0. If we had a lot of money, we'd get a C-Box or whatever that could do dissolved oxygen.
Yeah, because I would imagine most of your beers have been sitting in the barrel are well below 1, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It probably around 0.5 for the most part, and even re-fermenting. So what we do is we have GW Kensel. It's a Euro transport tank. It's sort of like a Grundy. It's just a small pallet jackable tank. We'll put whatever beers that we're blending into there, either after we've been on fruit, or often we'll sort of re-ferment on fruit and then blend in a little bit more beer to get a certain volume or certain flavor, and then we will force carbonate up to about 1.6 or 1.7 volumes of CO2, get a good reading, know exactly where we are, and then we worry about priming it the rest of the way. And that way we're getting the benefit of having that rapid re-fermentation in the bottle. We rehydrate generally wine yeast, Premier Cuvée, 71B, just sort of easy dry wine. I'm a big fan
yeast. Of 71B, so
yeah, and something that's going to be pretty neutral, but acid tolerant, alcohol tolerant, going to be able to put up with being pushed into a tank that's at 32 degrees and then bottled the next day. Because we can pallet jack that tank, we literally just pallet jack it up and we'll rock it back and forth a little bit, make sure everything's mixed in there. It's very homebrew vibes from us still. But that way we know where we're starting. We know we're adding 1 or 1.5 volumes of sugar. We have a good volume reading at that point. And then we can let that yeast take over. And we find that makes for a very consistent product. We don't have like THP, tetrahydropyridine, can be a big issue in young sour beers if you just add the sugar, but not a fresh yeast. As the Brettanomyces wakes back up again, it can get a little mousy. It can get this. To me, it's like a Cheerios sort of flavor, like a weedy flavor on the finish. And some people like it, but once I keyed in on it, it's this very sort of lingering kind of thing. And the last thing, we're already bottle conditioning for 2, 3, 4 months. Sometimes THP can take 6 months or a year to clean up. And that just means, more storage space for bottles, unpredictable releases for our club members. And so anything we can do to make that beer ready to drink as soon as possible. And, hey, it's, you can open a bottle after a month and say, hey, this is as carbonated as I want it to be. You give it another month. Okay, it's tasting better and the carbonation is just about the same. That you don't have to worry about, hey, it's getting more carbonated. Is it
Hey, it's going to explode my kitchen.
Yeah. And luckily so far we had one bottle that was a little overcarbed, and that was against my better judgment. We used cranberry juice.
So, I mean, you don't pasteurize them at some point or anything to kill them off, right? You just serve them naturally carbonated, I guess.
Exactly. We do have a bath pasteurizer. We pasteurize our imperial stouts, our barrel-aged imperial stouts. And I'm threatening to do a imperial stout blend with, say, a sour red. The brewery out in California does a beer called Melange Number One that's Black Tuesday, their barrel-aged imperial stout blended with Ode Tart, their sour red. And that is, I think I first had that probably 10 years ago. It's still one of the best, most interesting beers I've ever had. And I would love to do something with our own spin on that concept. But I'd love to be able to pasteurize it because that would sort of maintain that balance between the sweetness of the imperial stout, the acidity of the sour red. You can certainly do, and I've played around with like a soured stout, but often you have that roast, and then it dries out because the bread's going to eat all the sugars, and then it's going to get sour. It can be a very harsh drinking experience. That's the kind of thing that I would consider pasteurizing because there was a reason to do it.
Right.
And that, to be able to, and in that case, we would probably have to fully force carbonate the beer, make sure it's as clean as possible, maybe add some biofine or something like that, bottle it, and then immediately pasteurize it.
Now, I think a lot of things you're doing have remained constant in the 3 years you've been doing sours, right?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, our sort of like general approach to, fruiting, particularly for the barrel-aged stuff, as much as we can work with local farmers, with, local orchards. We've done a little bit of foraging for wild fruit. We did a beer with wineberries, which are sort of a blackberry raspberry cousin. I want to do as much as I can to support local agriculture, but also allows me to make beers that aren't going to be exactly like anyone else's. You have that kettle sour with that cherry puree. Pretty much that beer from any brewery is going to be within the same circle of confidence, in the same way that I can make a Citra hopped IPA. You can make a Citra hopped IPA. You may have gotten a little bit better Citra. You might have a little bit higher hopping rate. Your yeast strain may, but in general, you're going to kind of know that ballpark beer before you even have it. Right. If it's good, you could have a lousy version of that. Maybe
this is a good time to mention some of you had given me a list of collaborations that you're working on that are kind of interesting with sour beers.
Yeah, so that was one. So that was called Invasive Species that we did last year. Was sort of a really fun beer. We got local red wine barrels from a natural winery, Old Westminster by us. And we did this silly base beer. Scott for a long time had wanted to do a 5-grain Saison. So we went down to a little local grain farm in Southern Maryland. It was run by an eccentric German man. And we got buckwheat and millet that he milled for us. And then he got us he grows like hard, the kind of corn you would make like masa out of. And a chef from a local restaurant called Foraged Eatery did a nixtamalization on it. So he soaked it in lye. He softened it for us. And then we got just sort of barley and spelt were the other 2 grains. And so it was just this, we got awful efficiency. We got like 42% efficiency because we were just dumping in unmalted, ungelatinized grains. But in a way, it worked out perfectly because we actually ended up with, a 4.5% beer after it dried out. We aged in these beautiful red wine barrels that they'd just emptied, and then we picked about 50 pounds of these little raspberry. They to me they almost taste like little mini jelly donuts. They have this really intense raspberry flavor that's almost that's more intense than a fresh raspberry. Really fun beer, really unique flavors. And it's the kind of beer that, again, you can have 100 different raspberry beers, but none of them is going to taste like this one that had these wine berries that we foraged on a sweltering hot August day. My arms were all scratched up from all the prickers. And partly it was a lower fruiting rate than I would have done had I just been able to buy these things.
Right.
But like to me, like, yeah, making really interesting beers. And that's sort of like what we try to do with collaborations. We just released one with Aslan Brewery that's down in Alexandria, Virginia, and Herndon. And part of that collab was that they stopped by the brewery and they brought some of their house microbe culture. So they had a culture they'd started and held on to and sort of knew how it worked. And we got a couple of fresh white wine barrels and we added that. They were Pinot Gris barrels and added their culture to those. And then when it was done, we blended some of those barrels, some of our barrels with our house microbes onto peaches and nectarines from Milburn Orchard, which is up in Elkton, Maryland. And so again, like I love collabs that have a little bit more to them than just you like IPAs, I like IPAs, let's brew an IPA together.
Right.
Another fun one we have going is with Bissell Brothers up in Maine. Sort of the same idea. They sent us a couple of growlers of one of their house souring microbe cultures. And we ended up doing a beer with Phantasm, which is powdered New Zealand wine grape skins. And then we did a primary fermentation with the Omega Cosmic Punch strain, which is, they call it thiolized. So it's a CRISPR-Cas9 modified English ale yeast that they have taken the genes from a wine yeast that can free these thiols, which are intensely fruity, passion fruit, gooseberry sort of things. They're really a signature of
I mean, they're really
wines.
They're also the center of a lot of IPAs now, right? A lot of the fruity, IPAs.
Yeah, well, and I guess it turns out that people were sort of talking up thiols for a while.
Yeah.
And it turned out that there really weren't a lot in them if you use a traditional brewer's yeast strain. So if you use Conan or English ale yeast, you might be able to get a little bit of these thiols. But,
right, and there's only certain hops that have them as well. So
exactly.
Of course, the winemakers have known about thiols forever, but
exactly. And one of the tricks with thiols, though, for better or worse, is that they are very reactive with oxygen. And so it's a little bit of an experiment. We've done a couple of stainless steel IPAs, double IPAs, all those sorts of things. Great results. Barrel aging them, though, maybe the thiols will be oxidized by the time that beer is ready to serve. We're hoping to get some fresh wine grapes, maybe closer to the end.
Yeah.
But maybe they'll protect it and it will have a fresher, brighter flavor. Maybe the Brett will be able to scavenge the oxygen before the thiols are oxidized. Mm-hmm. So it's really sort of a learning experience for us. Bissell Brothers has never done something like this. We've never done something like this. This beer may never be released if it doesn't taste delicious. And that's sort of the fun and the risk of a collab like this. Mm-hmm. Sort of the one that we have going sort of most actively right now, we just got on to honey. A friend of ours works at Superstition Meadery out in Prescott, Arizona. And about maybe a year and a few months ago, he sent me a text message. He said, "Hey, we just emptied these cool barrels. They had Danish cherry juice in them for an apple cider, and I can't remember, they were cherry brandy barrels before that. And we don't have anything to refill them, but if you guys just want to, hire a trucking company to come grab these barrels, they're yours." I've
actually been to that meadery. They make some great meads out there in Prescott, Arizona. I can recommend them.
Yeah, they do. And I really appreciate that they, again, sort of like us, they have a unique take on things. They're not just sort of doing the most obvious thing. So we threw a pale sour in there, and then I texted Zeke back and said, "Hey, that beer's tasting pretty good. Let's add some honey to it." Our brewery, Scott, is vegan. We try our best to be vegan for almost all of our beers, but I get one honey beer a year. And honey, again, is one of those ingredients that you can get from a local apiary. We got 70 pounds of clover honey from Lord Byron Apiary, which is up a little bit north of Baltimore. I went up there to pick up the honey. I met Byron. He was a really fun guy. He has all these old labeler machines for his different bottles that he's rebuilding. He was asking me if there's any way he could maybe homebrew in his old double cookers that they used to warm up the honey for packaging or whatever. And again, you get to meet interesting people, and we got a product that is a different clover honey than anyone else's clover honey. And I know clover honey isn't maybe the most exciting or most unique honey in the world, but this was just sort of a pale sour. It was in this fun barrel, and so we wanted something that would sort of be, not too aggressive, and just maybe add a little bit of a layer of flavor.
Well, Michael, we're actually running a little bit low on time, but I wanted to ask just one more topic. You mentioned blending a whole bunch, and I think most of your sours are blended, so I wanted to just give you a minute or two to talk about blending. How do you pick the sours to blend? How do you know which ones to blend? How do you blend?
So I mean, that's obviously partly it is, and sort of what I was saying earlier, of like getting your ducks in a row first, having a bunch of things that are available to blend. As a home brewer, I think you're much better off having 10 5-gallon carboys with different microbes and different base beers, and some with wood and some without, rather than one 50-gallon bourbon barrel that you just really don't have any options with. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's sort of the same thing. People always say, "Oh, when are you getting a food, or when are you going to get a 20-barrel oak tank?" And to me, it doesn't make sense until I could have 4 or 5 of those that would allow me to blend them in some sort of meaningful way.
Right.
Unless I was really just looking for a base to put fruit onto or something like that. But if it got too sour, you don't have many options. So usually for a normal blend, what we'll do is myself, my partner Scott, our brewer Ken, maybe our tasting room manager Spencer, we'll block off an hour. We'll go over to the barrel cellar. We open up, I've got a big spreadsheet with fill dates and sortable by gravities and all sorts of things. And usually what it is we'll have an idea. Hey, we're going to do Marion berries on this strong, dark Vin de Cereal sour. Fine. Let's pull samples of all 5 of them, take gravity readings of all 5 of them. Hopefully we have recent gravity readings, say from a month or 2 ago, to compare and say, yep, these are all stable. And then it's a little bit of a Tetris kind of thing, where you might say, okay, these 2 have the same gravity, these 2 have the same gravity. Let's taste those 2 blended. Do those work? Usually what we'll do is try to pick our favorite blend and make that the non-fruited beer. So if we've got 5 oak barrels, in an ideal world, we'd probably do 2 of those blended without fruit, 2 of those blended with fruit. And so we'll try to make the best beer without fruit. And then usually the fruited one is like, wow, this barrel isn't sour enough. Well, as you were saying earlier, fruit is going to add acid. Yeah. That re-fermentation, those simple sugars are going to help acid production. And also fruit is just going to add another layer. And if a beer isn't, I would never blend in bad beer, but I would blend in bland beer. That, hey, this barrel just isn't very exciting. It's a little bit tart, but the Brett character really never came through. Mm-hmm. That's a great candidate for fruit, because the fruit then is going to be the signature oomph, the aroma. It's going to, that re-fermentation. And so I tend to focus on, making that best beer I can, hopefully with a couple of gravities that are pretty close. On fruit, I'm okay with the gravities being a little bit further apart, because the microbes in the drier one will go after the sugars that are left in the sweeter one.
Right.
Probably. For the bottle, if we're just doing clean, I try not to have to blend and then let them sit together for a while. I try to pick 2 that are close enough. And if they're within, if they're 2 points away, so like 0.002 different, that will average out to a 1 point difference, which is enough for about half a volume of CO2.
Interesting.
And so then just the question is, do you feel comfortable saying it will dry out and I'm going to go for 2.6 volumes calculated and assume if it gets up as high as 3.1 that's still in the
still
safe
drinkable,
range.
Yeah.
But then I might want to give it a little bit more time in the bottle and just say, okay, it got the initial fermentation done. I'm going to give it another 2 months and just make sure it really is there, or if it gets a little bit higher, that's sort of a stable place. I try never to release. We've been good so far. We have yet to recall a beer, and that's our goal. Our goal is not to put out bad beer. If that means sitting on beer a little longer, I'd rather. A lot of breweries will do the right things after something goes wrong and apologize or issue refunds. That's why we're pasteurizing our barrel-aged imperial stouts, because the odds of 200 pounds of coconut and vanilla beans and coffee and barrel aging, and there not being anything in that beer that finished at 12 or 13 Plato, like 1050, eventually.
Hard to get all those right at the same time, right?
Yeah. And so for me, and we've sent a couple of our beers in for PCR, and we've gotten some diastatic hits on those barrel-aged imperial stouts. I'm happy pasteurizing them. I think if anything, it improves the flavor, and it allows me to sleep well at night, that I'm selling someone a premium product that they can sit on long-term without worry.
Nice.
And honestly, like, I think sour beer really does develop, and the Brett keeps working in the bottle. I don't think bottle conditioning or that sort of thing is as valuable for an imperial stout, where you're really more thinking about just the flavors fading over time, or oxidation, or things like that. So everyone has different risk tolerances. I'd rather put in a little extra work, a little extra time, and not have to apologize later, because I hate apologizing. I hate screwing up.
Well, Michael, there's a couple other topics I wanted to cover, but we're out of time for today. So it gives me an excuse to invite you back, hopefully, and talk about sour beers again in the future. But I really do. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I love sours. And I love talking about them.
Well, I really do appreciate you coming on the show today. Thank you so much for being here, Michael.
Thanks for having me on, and I'll talk to you hopefully sooner rather than later.
And my guest today was Michael Tonsmeire, author of the book on sour beers, as well as founder of Sapwood Cellars, which is located in Columbia, Maryland. Thanks again, Michael.
Cheers.
A big thank you to Michael Tonsmeire for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the brewhouse controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brewhouse controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And the web-based version of BeerSmith with the new inventory module is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, your tablet, or your mobile device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version of BeerSmith for one low price. Check out beersmithrecipes.com today to give it a try. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.